helping needy people. We are to provide material help to those who are truly in need. Here's Gene to explain.
One of the reasons that is stated that way is because there are people reaching out for help and they're not truly in need. Or they wouldn't be in need if they were responsible individuals. And that's why Paul in the New Testament became very blunt with the Thessalonians and said, if you don't work, you don't eat. In other words, you don't hand out things to people who can work, but they won't. In other words, they're lazy. And it's really interesting that Paul puts laziness in the same category almost as immorality in terms of discipline and how the church had handled that. And so that's an important principle that's stated very clearly. But there are always people who are really in need. They would work if they could. They would provide for their own if they could. But they're strapped. There are problems. They can't do it. And there are a lot of people like that in the world. And a lot of Christians like that in the world. So we're to provide material help to those who are truly in need. Leviticus 23:22 gives us a very interesting concept here. And this, of course, is agricultural. It relates to Israel. When you reap the harvest of your land, and that was their main way of making a living, you're not to reap all the way to the edge of your field, or to gather the gleanings of your harvest. Read the book of Ruth, and you'll understand the background to that story a little more fully when you understand this law. Leave them, that is, the gleanings of your harvest and the outer boundaries of your harvest, of your crops, leave them for the poor. Another verse said, the poor will always be with us. So the rule there is leave them for the poor and the foreign resident. Not only for your own people, but for the foreigners who are among you, the people of Egypt who came out with you, and those in the area that joined in with Israel and wanted to be a part of this clan that God had chosen. And so God covers the waterfront, as it were, in terms of your own as well as the foreigners in this particular situation. Now, when you get into the book of Acts, you see a beautiful illustration of how this worked out in the New Testament. When the church was born, there were many, many people that had gathered there in Jerusalem from all over the Roman world, and the Holy Spirit came, the church was born, and many of the people stayed to see what was going to happen next, and there were a lot of needy people. They ran out of money. And notice in Acts chapter 4, for there was not a needy person among them, because all those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, laid them at the apostles' feet. This was then distributed to each person as anyone had need. And here is a principle. The principle is not selling all that we have. The principle is meeting the needs of those who are truly in need. And so the principle coming from this passage is generosity. As followers of Jesus Christ, we're to be godly models of generosity. And we see that taking place here in this situation. As they took care of each other within this crucial moment, which was a semi-communal system, which was not God's plan indefinitely, but for that moment in the church's history, it's a wonderful model of generosity. Eventually, people went back to their homes in the various parts of the Roman world and made a living. That's why Paul had to address that issue with the Thessalonians, because Paul said that Jesus Christ was going to come and remove you from this world. And so they said, well, if Jesus Christ is going to come, why work? We'll just wait until he comes. And they totally misunderstood that doctrine. We're to be responsible individuals. So they went back to a more normal way of making a living, where we're all responsible to take care of our own. Remember, they had a problem with the widows, the Grecian widows there in Jerusalem. And they had to set up a system to care for those Grecian widows. Who were the Grecian widows? Those were the ones that came from all over the Roman world for the 40-day or 50-day celebration there in Jerusalem. And they ran out of money first. But when they stayed in Jerusalem, these Grecian widows were being neglected in this daily distribution of food. And so they set up a system, temporary system, to take care of them at that time and their need. There's another passage that deals with widows particularly, and Paul addressed this with Timothy. He said, support widows who are genuinely widows, which means that not all widows were genuinely widows. If you read the New Testament, there were some widows that were incredibly wealthy, like Lydia, who may have been a widow there in Philippi, a very wealthy woman, like Mark's mother, Mary, who had this huge home in Jerusalem. We don't know why she had all of this wealth, but that's where the church first met, was in an upper room, a huge upper room there in Jerusalem. And by the way, if you ever go to Jerusalem, go down under the city where they've excavated, you'll find homes that are 8,000 to 10,000 square feet in size. They've excavated some of those homes. It was homes like that where the church met. So there were a lot of wealthy people, and some of them were widows. And so Paul said, you've got to deal, if they're in need, you've got to make sure, if they say they're in need, they're genuinely widows. They're not just taking advantage of the church and of the church's generosity. Of course, that principle applies to anybody. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they should learn to practice their religion towards their own family first, to repay their parents, for this pleases God. In other words, the family is incredibly responsible to take care of people in that family, the close-knit family, that are truly in need. Now, people are taking, not children are taking advantage and manipulating, controlling, because that's enabling. But if there's true needs, then as a family, we're responsible for each other. Not the church, but the family, first of all. And that's, Paul said, that's where we need to go first. Now, that family may be just as in need as everybody. It might be the whole family. So consequently, we have to make sure we understand that. Another passage says, if any believing woman has widows, which may mean someone like Lydia, who's a widow who has daughters or daughter-in-laws who are widows, whose husbands were killed in the Roman wars, for example, and they're truly in need, but this widow, like Lydia or like Mary, has resources, then she should help them because of her own resources. Don't go to the church, but help them from your own resources, he's saying here. You have to understand the culture to understand what was going on here. And the church should not be burdened so that it can help those who are genuinely widows. So the Bible speaks of the fact that we should help needy people. Now let me read that principle again so we focus it. We're to provide material help to those who are truly in need. So the question is, what system should we develop today to be able to practice generosity and hospitality without allowing people to take advantage? We need a system because our culture is different. And we need to understand what are true needs. And that's very difficult sometimes to ferret that out. And over the years, our church has developed a reputation as being a very generous church. Do you think that word gets out? There are people who are professionally given over to taking advantage of the church. And I could tell you stories that you wouldn't believe. Like a mother who pulls up in front of the church offices with a baby in her arms, and it's 20 degrees outside, and she comes into the church office barefoot. Now, immediately that sends a signal of manipulation and control. Now, she may not have any shoes, but I'm probably pretty sure she has shoes. She's trying to ply on her sympathy. I saw that happen. Got a call one time from a woman who said, my landlord is throwing me out. I don't have a cent to make my mortgage payment. And I said, well, could I talk with your landlord? Give me his name, phone number. Called the landlord, quote, end quote. Oh, yes, I'm going to put her out on the street. Well, I knew something was wrong. Found out later it was her boyfriend. It shouldn't surprise us. But to check it out, that was on a Friday. I said, well, we have a Friday night church. You have a car. Can you get here? Can somebody bring you? Yes. I said, I'd like to meet you because we want to help you. She never showed up. Now, I can tell you story after story after story. I can also tell you stories where I have been so vulnerable and gullible where people have taken advantage of me because I have a real soft touch. And when people tell me something, I want to believe it. And I remember a guy who walked into the church one time between services. We just finished the first service. I was still on the platform getting ready for the next service. And there's a guy standing right down there below the platform. And I saw him standing there. He was just standing there and trying to get my attention. And he knew exactly how to get my attention because he just stood there, just watched me. And finally, I walked over and I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "Well, yes, you can." Now, the first clue that I was about to be taken is he called me Brother Gene. And nobody calls me Brother Gene. But being vulnerable and gullible, I didn't even think about it at that point. And then he saw me kind of look quizzical, and because I'm trying to figure out who he is because I didn't recognize him. And that was in his plan too, because he said, "Oh, you know who I am. I attend your church here. I live right over here." Now that should have been clue number 2, but it went in one ear and out the other. And then he told his story, how his wife had flown to Tucson because his mother was in the hospital, and then his wife was in a car accident on the way to the hospital. She's in the same hospital, and I get paid not tomorrow, but in a week, and I'll pay you back, and I've got half the money for the airfare, and I need the other half. And I said, "Well, how much do you need?" He said, $50. Tells you how long ago that was. And so I'm in a hurry. He caught me at a moment where I knew I wanted to meet his need. I wanted to help. Sounded authentic. Really? And I saw one of our elders walking down the aisle, and I walked over and said, "We got an emergency. Do you have $50? And he said, "Sure." And he took out his billfold and gave me $50, and I walked over and gave it to him. Shocked the guy so much he stood around a little bit and talked to me. And then he left. And by the way, he told me where the hospital was and so forth and so on. Later I called. There was no hospital. There was no situation. It was totally made up. Reconstructed it. How did he find out what my name is? He read the sign outside the church. Walked in. Don Logue had a name tag. He said, "Hi, Don. Where's Gene?" Don said, "Gene's right down there." Came down, said, "Brother Gene." So the scheme is unfolding, and I fell for it. Now, I'd rather err on generosity. But if I had just walked over to another pastor and said, "I need some help. What do you think about this?" And he probably would have pounded sense into my head within about a minute. And I would have checked it out. Or I'd have delegated and said, "You need to check this out, see whether it's authentic, delegate it to someone," and so forth. Now that's how sneaky people are. I can tell you story after story after story of people who take advantage of the Church of Jesus Christ. So that's why this principle is in the Bible. And we have to develop a system. And that's not easy, to develop a system. And when people come and they have a need, and one of the first questions you ask them is, who is your family? What are their resources? Do they know about your need? Do you think they might be able to help you? What are your own resources? Do you have any savings? Do you have investments? And when they start getting defensive, you know that you're touching nerves. Because if they're really in need, they'll tell you everything, absolutely everything. And so we have a system that we had to set up to be generous and to meet the needs of people who are really in need, but to make sure that we ferret out those who are just manipulating or selfish or are trying to take advantage of other believers. And so that does happen, and that's one of the challenges. But this is an important principle because we are to meet the needs of people who are really in need. And so if you're going to do that, we need a system to make sure in a sensitive, loving way we discover who those people really are.